The millionaire who terrorized the company was silenced by the new secretary, and the reason is unbelievable. Before we start, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me," murmured Riley, weaving around employees walking like sleepy turtles. "First day on the job, and I'm already late." In her hand, she balanced a tray with 2 coffees. One for her, the other to try to impress the boss she hadn't even met yet, Maxwell Crawford, the man who, according to rumors, had the charm of Squidward and the sweetness of a lime. She passed the reception desk, trying to smile at the young woman at the counter, but her left heel slipped on the shiny floor. The tray jumped, and in her reflex to catch it, she lost her balance even more. And as if it were fate or divine punishment, right in front of her appeared a tall man, perfectly tailored suit, serious expression, walking as if even gravity bowed to him. Maxwell Crawford. The 2 coffee cups flew, tracing a perfect arc in the air before landing squarely on his chest and tie. The hot liquid spread, leaving a brown stain on a suit that probably cost more than $1,000. The murmur in the reception area stopped. Even the security guard, scrolling through his phone, looked up as if expecting a scene. Riley froze, breathing quickly, her eyes moving from the stain on his suit to his face. Maxwell lowered his gaze to his chest and then slowly looked back at her. The silence between them felt heavier than the soaked fabric. Then, in a moment that could only be called professional suicide, she blurted out, "At least it matches your suit. It's premium latte, so don't worry." A collective gasp swept through the lobby. Maxwell frowned, his jaw tense. He didn't seem like a man used to hearing sarcasm, much less accepting it. "You," he began, his voice low, firm, and filled with irritation. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Riley swallowed hard. "I spilled coffee on your suit, but technically I increased its value. Premium coffee, you know?" She forced a nervous smile. Maxwell blinked slowly, as if trying to decide if she was a bold employee or someone completely out of her mind. "This is a custom-made suit from Italy. It costs more than your annual salary." She bit her lip. "Look on the bright side, now you're nicely scented." A ripple of shock moved through the employees. Someone in the back muttered a muffled, "Oh my God." Maxwell took a step forward, and Riley realized he was even more intimidating up close. The smell of coffee mixed with his expensive cologne was almost an olfactory declaration of war. "Your name," he ordered. "Riley Parker. Your new secretary." He raised his eyebrows, and for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible, curiosity, crossed his irritated gaze. "Perfect. First day, and you're already on my list of urgent matters." Riley tried to explain. "I was just trying to be nice, bringing you coffee, and for me too, because, well, mornings." She gestured, realizing she was waving a coffee-stained hand. "Okay, I'll stop." Maxwell took a deep breath, clearly fighting for patience. "Go to my office, in 10 minutes, and bring." He looked at the tray on the floor, a cloth. She blinked, unsure if he was serious or if this was some cruel test. "Right, boss." When he walked away, the murmuring began again. 2 interns started whispering excitedly, and the receptionist said with a mischievous smile, "10 minutes in, and you've already made history." Riley sighed. "Yeah, welcome to the dream job, Parker." The elevator seemed to climb slower than any in engineering history. At each floor, Riley replayed the coffee splash in her head, imagining the possible consequences: public humiliation, immediate firing, becoming a hallway legend, the girl who ruined the boss's suit. When she finally reached the 27th floor, the hallway felt like a silent courtroom. The door to Maxwell's office was open, but his figure, standing with his back to her looking out the window, made her hesitate. "Come in," he said without turning around. She took 2 steps, holding the cloth like a shield. I'm sorry about the coffee. It was an accident. I really wanted to make a good impression." He turned slowly. The stain on his suit was still there, but his look wasn't just anger, it was assessment, as if he were studying every word and gesture. "Impression, Parker, is something you make with work, not with," he glanced at his chest, "latte." She nodded. "I understand, so I guess I shouldn't bring donuts tomorrow?" Maxwell didn't respond. He simply walked over to the desk, picked up a folder, and set it down in front of her. "Work for today. Let's see if you're better at typing than serving coffee." Riley took the folder, keeping her chin up. I'm great at typing, and at serving coffee too, when the floor isn't conspiring against me. For a second, she could have sworn she saw the corner of his mouth threaten to smile, but it was gone just as quickly. You can go. And, Parker, he called out as she was already at the door. Don't spill anything else on me. All right? She replied before leaving. As she closed the door, Riley knew two things. First, she wasn't going to make things easy for that man. Second, he wasn't going to make things easy for her either. Riley arrived on the second day, determined to prove that the coffee incident had been nothing more than a rough start. Little did she know that Maxwell Crawford had spent the entire night crafting a strategy any war general would be proud of. At 8:15 sharp, the phone on her desk rang. Parker. My office. Now. His voice came over the intercom with the chill of an iceberg. She sighed, straightened her blouse, and walked down the hall, noticing the way employees watched her with a mix of curiosity and pity. It was as if they were watching someone walk to their own funeral. Sit, Maxwell ordered, without looking up from a document that seemed more important than world peace. Riley sat down, hands folded in her lap, waiting for the verdict. I have a few tasks for you, he began, finally lifting his gaze with a smile that never reached his eyes. First, I need you to organize all the financial department's files alphabetically, then by date, then by relevance. Deadline noon. Riley blinked. Mr. Crawford, there are over 1,000 documents. Your problem? He cut in, pretending to read again. Oh, and I need a detailed report on the third-floor employees' productivity. For today as well. Today, 5 o'clock. And I need... He paused dramatically, clearly savoring the moment. 1 silver paperclip. Just one. Riley frowned. A silver paperclip? Exactly. Not gold, not white, not chrome. Silver. For an extremely important presentation. She stayed silent for a few seconds, processing. May I ask what for? No. You may go. Riley left his office with an expression somewhere between disbelief and determination. In the elevator, she muttered to herself, You want war? You'll get war. 2 hours later, Maxwell was arriving at his office when he heard a strange noise coming from inside. Something metallic, like someone pouring coins. Curious, he quickly opened the door. Riley stood in front of his desk, smiling like a cat that had just discovered where the fish was hidden. Maxwell's desk was completely covered in silver paper clips, thousands of them, scattered like shiny confetti. I brought all I could find. You can pick the best one, she said as casually as if she'd brought him a cup of coffee. No need to thank me. Maxwell froze in the doorway, speechless. In the middle of the desk, among the paper clips, was a handwritten note. Hope one of these works for your extremely important presentation. Parker, what is this? The silver paperclip you asked for, she replied, keeping her sarcastic smile. A few employees began to gather discreetly in front of the glass wall, whispering excitedly. Maxwell looked at the desk, then at Riley, then back at the desk. Something between irritation and disbelief crossed his face. How did you get so many silver paper clips? I borrowed them from a few offices in the building. Everyone was more than happy to help when they heard it was for Maxwell Crawford. And the productivity report? Riley pulled a folder from under her arm and set it down on the only uncluttered corner of the desk. Done, with colorful charts and everything. Turns out the third floor is 23% more productive when they have access to good coffee and background music. Interesting find. Maxwell flipped through the folder quickly and, to his own surprise, found it impeccably organized and detailed. And the financial files? Sorted alphabetically, chronologically, and by relevance. It was too easy, so I also added categories by cover color and by document thickness. You never know when that might come in handy. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of paperclips sliding off the desk when Maxwell tried to lean on it. You did all this in one morning? And still had time for lunch, she said, checking her watch. By the way, I brought sandwiches for the team. They're in the kitchen, in case anyone's interested. An excited murmur spread among the curious employees. Maxwell took a deep breath, clearly recalculating his strategy. Tomorrow I want my desk clean. And coffee, regular coffee. Of course, boss. When Riley left, Maxwell was alone with his 10,000 silver paper clips, trying to figure out how things had gotten so completely out of his control. The next morning, Maxwell walked into the office expecting to find a spotless desk and a steaming cup of coffee waiting for him. Instead, he found a tray of donuts arranged like a piece of art. They weren't ordinary donuts. The icing on each one formed a letter, and together they spelled out a message: leaders inspire, bosses sour. Maxwell stood there staring at the sugary masterpiece when Riley appeared at the door. "Good morning. I thought you could use a little sugar to sweeten your mood." "Parker, the donuts are from a French bakery, gourmet. I figured they'd suit your refined taste." Maxwell picked up one of the donuts, noting the perfection of the icing. "You decorated these?" "I spent 2 hours at the bakery teaching the baker. He said he'd never made donuts with motivational messages before." "Motivational? It's a modern leadership technique. Inspirational sweets. I read about it in an article from the Harvard Business Review." Maxwell took a bite, and even though he tried to keep a straight face, he had to admit, it was delicious. "And the coffee? Oh, I thought you were doing a caffeine detox. I read somewhere that executives are adopting healthier habits." She left the room, leaving Maxwell annoyed, alone with his philosophical donuts and his decaf coffee. Downstairs at reception, things were unusually lively. Employees were gathered in small groups, whispering excitedly. James, the security guard, had set up a betting board where people could guess the exact day Riley would be fired. "I'm betting on Friday," said Sandra from IT. "No one can last 5 days making Crawford look like a fool." "I don't know," murmured Tom from marketing. "She seems to be having fun, and honestly, so does he." "What do you mean? You didn't notice? Yesterday he laughed. When she walked out with the paper clips, I saw it through the glass." "Maxwell Crawford doesn't laugh," Sandra shook her head. "At best, he smiles when he's firing someone." James, watching from his post, added another bet to the board. Monday, Sandra from IT. But what no one noticed was Maxwell standing upstairs, watching the scene through the security cameras. And what absolutely no one saw was the genuine smile he hid behind his hand as he bit into his second donut of the morning. The war had officially begun, and for the first time in years, Maxwell Crawford was having fun at work. Later, the boardroom on the 30th floor of Crawford Enterprises had never felt so tense. 5 major investors, the kind who decide a company's fate over breakfast, were seated around the mahogany table, while Maxwell adjusted his tie for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. His suit was flawless, as always. Every crease was sharp, every button polished to perfection. The I-know-everything aura he had cultivated over the years was firmly in place, like an invisible suit of armor. "Gentlemen," Maxwell began, clicking the remote to start the presentation. "Last quarter's numbers show a 15% growth across all strategic areas." Thomas Hartwell, a gray-haired investor with gold-rimmed glasses, flipped through some papers with a focused expression. Next to him, Margaret Chen took notes on a tablet, while the other 3 men studied the screen with professional attention. "Impressive, Crawford," Hartwell said. "These results exceed our initial projections." Maxwell smiled, the kind of smile he reserved for guaranteed victories. "Efficiency is our trademark. Every team member is carefully chosen to maximize productivity." At that moment, the door opened and Riley walked in, carrying a tray of coffee and wearing an apologetic expression. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, placing cups in front of each investor with the grace of someone who had practiced the motion 1,000 times. Maxwell watched her out of the corner of his eye, irritation rising in his throat. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not during a meeting this important. "This is our new secretary," he said, in a tone that managed to be both an introduction and a dismissal. "She's still adapting to our questionable efficiency standards." Riley paused mid-motion while handing coffee to Margaret Chen. For a moment, the silence in the room was heavier than the air before a storm. "Questionable?" she repeated, with a smile that looked far too innocent to be genuine. "Nothing personal, Parker, just an observation about the adjustment process." The investors exchanged discreet glances. Hartwell raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the dynamic unfolding before him. Riley finished serving the coffee, and instead of slipping out quietly as Maxwell expected, she walked over to the presentation screen. "May I make an observation about these numbers, Mr. Crawford?" Maxwell felt a chill in his stomach. "Parker, this isn't appropriate." It's just that, she continued, pointing to a chart on the screen. This says we had 15% growth. But if we consider the data I received from the finance department yesterday, the correct number would be 12%. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer one of expectation. It was surprise. Maxwell looked at the screen, then at Riley, then at the investors, who were now giving their full attention to the young secretary of questionable efficiency. "Are you sure about that?" asked Margaret Chen, with genuine curiosity. Riley pulled a folder she had quietly placed on a nearby chair. "I have the original reports right here. The mistake is in the sum of the third quarter figures. Someone rounded up a few decimals that, when added together, inflated the final result." She opened the folder and, to Maxwell's growing horror, began showing an impromptu presentation, complete with colorful charts and neatly organized tables that made his numbers look amateurish. "See," she said, pointing to a hand-drawn chart that was impressively detailed. "If we separate the results by department and adjust the margins of error, the actual growth is 12.3%. Still an excellent result, but more realistic." Hartwell leaned forward, studying the papers Riley had spread out on the table. "Are these calculations correct?" "I can guarantee they are. I spent 3 hours yesterday checking each number, because I believe transparency builds more trust than exaggeration." Maxwell felt as if the floor were shifting under his feet. Not only had Riley publicly corrected his numbers, but she had done it with an elegance that made the situation even more humiliating. "Interesting," murmured James Morrison, another investor. "How many years of experience do you have in financial analysis, Miss Parker?" "Riley Parker. And honestly, none. My degree is in communications. But numbers don't lie, no matter who's reading them." That's when it happened. Hartwell began to laugh. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine laugh that echoed through the conference room like thunder. "My goodness," he said, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "This girl is worth more than any stock in your company, Crawford." The other investors smiled, clearly entertained. Margaret Chen flipped through Riley's charts with obvious approval. Maxwell was torn between wanting to hide under the table and pulling Riley over for a toast. His irritation was real, but there was something else, something he refused to acknowledge as admiration. "Well," he said, trying to regain control of the situation, "I apologize for the unplanned interruption." "Interruption?" Hartwell shook his head. "That was clarification. I'd take honest numbers over colorful fantasies any day." Riley began gathering her papers. "I'll let you continue your meeting in peace. I just wanted to be sure everyone had the correct information." "Wait," said Margaret Chen. "You made these charts yourself?" "Yes, I used basic Excel and a little creativity with the colors." "How long did it take you?" Riley thought for a moment. "About 2 hours last night, after work." Morrison nodded, impressed. "Crawford, you might have found a diamond in the rough." Maxwell watched Riley head to the door, and for a moment their eyes met. There was challenge in hers, but also something like a silent question. "Do you still think my efficiency is questionable?" "Thank you for the correction, Parker," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Always at your service, boss." When the door closed behind her, Hartwell turned to Maxwell with a mischievous smile. 15 years investing in companies, and I've never seen a secretary correct the CEO in public with that much class. Either you promote her, or I'll hire her." Maxwell forced a laugh. "She's still in her trial period. If I were you, I'd make it permanent before she realizes her own worth." The rest of the meeting went on without incident, but Maxwell could hardly focus. His mind was busy processing what had just happened. Riley hadn't just challenged him in public. She'd done it with skill, intelligence, and a confidence bordering on boldness. When the investors finally left, Maxwell stayed alone in the room, looking at the charts Riley had forgotten on the table. They weren't just accurate, they were brilliant. For the first time in years, someone had completely thrown him off balance. And the most unsettling part was that he no longer knew if he wanted revenge or to find out what other surprises Riley Parker had up her sleeve. 3 days had passed since the incident in the conference room, and Riley was starting to notice things she hadn't paid attention to before. Yes, employees laughed more when she was around, but there was something in their eyes, a shadow that lingered even in lighter moments. It was Thursday, almost 7 in the evening, when she decided to stay late to finish some reports. The building was nearly empty, with only the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a vacuum breaking the silence. Maria, from the cleaning crew, was pushing her cart down the hall when Riley greeted her. "Hi, Maria. Working late tonight?" The woman, who looked to be in her 50s, smiled, but Riley noticed the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I always work late, dear. Ever since they cut our team, each of us has to cover 2 floors. Riley stopped typing. "They cut the team?" Maria glanced around, as if afraid the walls might be listening. 6 months ago. Mr. Crawford said it was to optimize costs. They also cut our health plan. Now we only have the basics. The health plan? It used to be good, covered dental, glasses, those kinds of things. Now, she shrugged, resigned. We make do. Riley felt a tightness in her chest. And the other employees? Were there cuts for them too? Maria lowered her voice even more. The 3rd floor lost their food allowance. The IT team doesn't get transportation vouchers anymore. And there's no more snacks in the kitchen after 3 in the afternoon. Why? Cost cutting, or so they say. Riley stayed quiet, processing the information. While Maxwell probably spent more on one suit than Maria earned in 2 months, employees were losing basic benefits. "Maria, can I ask you something? Why don't you all complain?" The woman laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Complain to who, dear?" Mr. Crawford isn't exactly known for taking suggestions, and jobs aren't easy to come by right now. We put up with it. That night, Riley went home with a knot in her stomach. She had thought Maxwell was just an arrogant, difficult boss, but finding out he was cutting benefits from people barely getting by while he strutted around in Italian suits changed everything. The next morning, Riley arrived at work 2 hours early. She had a mission. By 8 o'clock, when the first employees started arriving, they found an unusual scene in the office kitchen. Riley was there, wearing an improvised apron made out of paper towels, handing out fresh pastries and real coffee. Not the brownish liquid the machine usually produced. "Morning, Sandra," she greeted the IT woman, offering a still-warm pastry. "Special breakfast today." Sandra took the pastry, looking suspicious. "What's this?" "Operation Smile," Riley said with a wink. "Today, everyone eats well." Each pastry came with a note attached. Sandra opened hers and read it out loud. "Stay strong. Today you don't have to pretend you like him." She burst out laughing. "Riley, you're crazy." Within minutes, the kitchen was full of employees, all laughing at their notes. Tom, from marketing, laughed so hard at his that he nearly choked on his coffee. "Remember, he may be your boss, but you're the one who really keeps this company running." He read aloud. "Where did you get these pastries?" "I have my contacts," Riley replied mysteriously. In truth, she had gotten up at 5 in the morning to go to her neighborhood bakery and convince the owner to take a special order. James, from accounting, held his note like it was treasure. "Today's a good day to ask for a raise, or at least to add extra sugar to your coffee." He shook his head, impressed. "You really did this for everyone?" "You deserve it," Riley said simply. "You work hard and keep this place running. It's the least I can do." Maria appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her cleaning uniform, and Riley immediately offered her 2 pastries. "One for you and one for Conceição," she said, referring to Maria's coworker. When Maria read her note, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for keeping our workplace clean and welcoming. You are seen and appreciated." "Riley," Maria whispered. "Hey, no crying in the kitchen," Riley said, giving the woman a quick hug. "House rule." The buzz in the kitchen grew. Employees from other floors began showing up, drawn by the smell of real food and the sound of laughter. In minutes, what was supposed to be a simple breakfast had turned into a small, impromptu party. That's when Maxwell appeared. He stopped at the kitchen doorway, watching the scene with an expression that mixed confusion and suspicion. Lively conversations, genuine smiles, employees who usually barely said hello sharing tables and jokes. "What's going on here?" His voice cut through the chatter like a cold blade. The silence was instant, as if someone had pressed the mute button in real life. Riley turned, still holding a tray of pastries, and smiled as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. "Good morning, Mr. Crawford. Want a pastry? They're ham and cheese." Maxwell looked at the tray, then at the employees' faces, which now looked like kids caught doing something they shouldn't. "Parker, my office, now." Of course, she replied, setting the tray on the counter. Enjoy, everyone. There's plenty more. She started walking toward the door, but Maxwell intercepted her in the hallway. What exactly do you think you're doing? Breakfast, she said, as if the answer was obvious. This isn't breakfast. This is. Caring about employees? Recognition? Basic humanity? Maxwell took a deep breath, clearly struggling to keep his composure. You can't just show up here and change the office dynamic. Why not? It's working. Working? He repeated, incredulous. You've turned the kitchen into a circus. I turned the kitchen into a place where people feel valued, she corrected. Maybe that's why you don't recognize it. Maxwell opened his mouth to respond, but Riley was already walking away. Sorry, she called over her shoulder. I have to save an intern from a stapler. What? Brian from finance. He's been trying to staple a report for 20 minutes, but the stapler's jammed and he's too shy to ask for help. If I don't step in soon, he's going to have a nervous breakdown. And with that, she disappeared down the hall, leaving Maxwell standing there, trying to process what had just happened. He glanced back into the kitchen, where the employees had resumed their conversations, though in slightly quieter tones. The smell of the pastries still lingered in the air, mixed with something he couldn't quite identify at first. After a few seconds, he realized what it was. Genuine happiness. Maxwell returned to his office, but he spent the whole morning looking out the window toward the floor below, watching employees who seemed different, lighter, more human. And in the back of his mind, a persistent question kept pounding. When was the last time he had really paid attention to the people who made his company run? The answer bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The following Monday, after what the employees had started calling the pastry rebellion, Maxwell walked into the office with a determination that bordered on obsession. Riley Parker had crossed a line, and he needed to regain control before she turned his company into some kind of corporate summer camp. At 10 a.m., he called her into his office. Riley walked in with her usual ease, carrying a cup of coffee and a notepad, as if it were just another routine meeting. Sit, Maxwell said, pointing to the chair across from his desk. She sat, crossed her legs, and waited, her expression one of innocent curiosity, which he was beginning to deeply mistrust. Maxwell opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, placing it on the desk with more force than necessary. I want to talk about this document. Riley leaned forward for a better look. It was a detailed financial report on benefit cuts from the last 6 months, exactly the kind of information she had used for her smile operation. And what about it? It's confidential. How did you get it? Riley leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Define confidential. Information restricted to senior management, Maxwell replied, his tone cold enough to chill her coffee. Oh, I see. So when Maria tells me she lost her health insurance, or when Tom mentions he no longer has a transportation allowance, that's senior management information? Maxwell's jaw tightened. What employees do in their personal lives is none of your business. Their personal lives, Riley repeated, her voice rising a notch. Mr. Crawford, you cut basic benefits from people who can barely afford rent. That's not personal life, that's survival. These are administrative decisions necessary to keep the company competitive. Competitive? She opened her notepad and checked a few notes. The company made a profit of $23 million last quarter. Do you know how much it would cost to keep the benefits you cut? $300,000 a year. Maxwell stayed silent, surprised by the precision of her numbers. How did you? Basic math. I took the payroll data, calculated the cost of benefits, and compared it with the profit reports. You don't need to be upper management to add 2 and 2. You're not authorized to access payroll data. Riley sighed and closed the notebook. You don't need proof. You incriminate yourself every single day. The silence that followed was unlike any they'd ever shared. It wasn't the awkward silence of the first day, nor the tense silence of their provocations. It was something denser, charged with an electricity that made the air in the room feel heavier. Maxwell looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she had stormed into his life like a hurricane of spilled coffee and sharp comebacks. There was determination in her eyes, yes, but also something he couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger, nor challenge. Was it disappointment? "Why do you care so much?" he asked, his voice lower, more personal than he intended. Riley held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because someone has to care, and apparently you've forgotten how." She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "You know the difference between a leader and a boss, Mr. Crawford? A leader takes care of the people who follow them. A boss just counts the money they make." With that, she walked out, leaving Maxwell alone with his thoughts and a strange feeling in his chest that he refused to name. That night, Maxwell stayed in the office long past his usual time. Not because there was urgent work, but because he couldn't stop thinking about their conversation that morning. Riley's words echoed in his mind like a stubborn echo. He tried to convince himself she was wrong, that his decisions were purely professional and necessary. But every time he thought about the employees' faces during Operation Smile, genuinely happy for the first time in months, something inside him twisted uncomfortably. The next morning, Riley arrived at work to find a white envelope on her desk. No sender's name, just hers, written in elegant, masculine handwriting she recognized instantly. Inside was a simple card with only one line: dinner. 8 p.m. Below, the address of a restaurant she knew was extremely expensive. The kind of place where people booked tables 2 months in advance and where the maitre d' knew clients by name and bank account. Riley turned the card over, looking for more. Nothing. No reason, no context, not even a signature, though she knew exactly who had sent it. "Seriously?" she murmured to herself. All morning, she tried to focus on work, but her mind kept circling back to the invitation. Was it an attempt at intimidation? A professional trap? Or something else entirely? Jessica from accounting passed by her desk at lunchtime. "You okay? You look distracted." "Just thinking about a complicated decision," Riley replied. "Work-related?" Riley glanced at the envelope she had tucked into her drawer. "Honestly, I have no idea." That afternoon, she tried to read Maxwell's intentions by watching his behavior. He passed her desk 3 times in 2 hours, each time with some excuse about documents or reports, but he never mentioned dinner. In fact, he barely made eye contact. At 4 o'clock, Brian, the shy intern from finance, showed up with a stack of papers. "Riley, could you help me with these staples again? I know it's silly, but—" "Of course, Brian," she said, grateful for the distraction. While she unclogged the stapler, she noticed Maxwell standing in the doorway of the file room, watching. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, pretending to be deeply interested in a plant that had been there for 3 years. At 5:30, with most employees gone, Riley was still at her desk, staring at the envelope. The restaurant was elegant, expensive, definitely not the kind of place for discussing productivity reports. Tom passed by, jacket over his arm. "Staying late?" "Just finishing a few things," she lied. "Trouble in corporate paradise?" Riley laughed despite the tension. "Something like that." When Tom left, she was alone on the floor, with only the distant hum of the elevators and the drone of the air conditioning. Maxwell was still in his office. She could see the light on through the glass door. At 6:15, he finally came out, walked past her desk, and stopped. "Good night, Parker." "Good night, Mr. Crawford." He hesitated for a moment, as if about to say something more, but just nodded and headed for the elevator. Riley waited until the sound of the elevator faded completely before opening the drawer and taking the envelope out again. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the expensive paper and the smooth texture of the card. 7:45. She could still make it to the restaurant if she wanted to. The question was, did she want to? On one hand, it could be a trap. Maxwell trying to get something on her, or worse, trying to humiliate her in public. On the other hand, there had been something in the way he'd hesitated before leaving, something in the quality of the silence between them the morning before, that suggested far more complicated motives. At 7:50, Riley stood in front of the mirror in the women's restroom, touching up her lipstick and wondering if she was making the smartest or the stupidest decision of her life. The only way to find out was to go. Riley arrived at Le Bernardin at 8:05, a deliberate 5 minutes late. She had learned that showing up too early in uncertain situations could be seen as anxiousness or, worse, too much interest. The restaurant was exactly what she expected. Soft lighting, tables draped in white linen, waiters moving like silent dancers, and a menu that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The kind of place where wealthy people brought other wealthy people to impress even more wealthy people. "I have a reservation," she told the maître d', a middle-aged man with a perfectly practiced professional smile. "Name?" Riley hesitated. Maxwell hadn't given her any details about the reservation. "Crawford?" she tried. "Ah, yes, table for 6. Mr. Crawford has already arrived along with the other guests." 6 people? Riley felt her stomach sink. She had prepared herself for a tense dinner between 2 corporate adversaries, not for a disguised business meeting. The maître led her through the main dining room to a round table near the windows, offering a spectacular view of the glowing city. Maxwell was there, impeccable in a navy blue suit, talking animatedly with 4 people Riley didn't recognize: 2 middle-aged men, an elegant woman, and a young man who seemed to be about their age. When Maxwell saw her approaching, his face lit up with a smile she had never seen before. It wasn't the sarcastic smile he saved for her provocations, nor the polished one he used in meetings. It was genuine, warm, almost charming. "Riley." He stood, extending his hand as if she were the guest of honor. "I'm so glad you could make it. Everyone, this is Riley Parker, our Director of Strategic Development." Director of Strategic Development. Riley kept her expression neutral as she greeted the strangers, but made a mental note to have a word with Maxwell about this sudden and fictional promotion. "David Chen, Chen Industries," said the first man, shaking her hand firmly. "Patricia Williams, financial consultant," introduced the elegant woman. "Robert Chen, David's son," said the young man with a friendly smile. "And I'm Michael Santos from Santos & Associates," the second man added. Riley took the seat Maxwell pulled out for her, still trying to understand the dynamics of the evening. From what she could gather from the conversation, they were all important clients or potential business partners. "Riley was instrumental in restructuring our internal processes," Maxwell went on, pouring wine from a bottle that probably cost more than her weekly paycheck. "Her innovative ideas have increased our efficiency by over 20%. She almost choked on her wine. Efficiency boosted by her ideas? The same man who had spent a week trying to make her quit was now practically creating an entire professional biography for her. "Impressive," Patricia remarked. "Is your background in business?" Riley shot a quick glance at Maxwell, who was watching her with an expectant and slightly amused expression. "Actually, my degree is in communications," she answered honestly. "But I believe organizational efficiency has a lot to do with clear communication and understanding people's needs." "An interesting perspective," David Chen said. "Could you elaborate?" Riley took a breath. If Maxwell wanted to play this game, she would play it. "Well, I've found that most productivity problems in companies don't come from broken systems or lack of resources, but from poor communication between management and staff. When people feel heard and valued, they naturally work better." "And how did you implement that at Crawford Enterprises?" Michael asked, clearly interested. Riley glanced at Maxwell, who now seemed genuinely curious to hear her answer. "We started with small steps: community breakfasts, recognition for individual work, transparency in decision-making." She took a sip of wine. "And of course reviewing policies that were hurting team morale." Maxwell nearly choked on his wine. "Policies?" David leaned in, interested. "Unnecessary cuts to basic benefits, for example. We found the cost-benefit of keeping them was much better than we initially thought." The look Maxwell gave her could have melted the ice in a water glass. But she smiled innocently and went on. "In fact, it was Mr. Crawford himself who insisted on the review. He said he'd rather have motivated employees than a few extra thousand in the bank." "Very wise," Patricia agreed. "Unmotivated employees cost much more in the long run." "Exactly what we thought," Riley said, raising her glass toward Maxwell with an angelic smile. The rest of the dinner went surprisingly well. Riley discovered she was good at talking about business strategies when she could be honest about her opinions, and the clients seemed genuinely impressed with her ideas. Maxwell, for his part, was in what she could only describe as polite Prince Charming mode. Attentive, charming, and occasionally even funny. Between the main course and dessert, Robert Chen remarked, "You two make quite a team. It's rare to see that kind of chemistry between a CEO and a director of development." Riley almost laughed. Chemistry? They'd spent the last 2 weeks in a corporate psychological war. The secret, Maxwell said with a mischievous look, is finding someone who's not afraid to disagree with you. And who's not easily impressed by expensive suits, Riley added, earning laughs around the table. That's when Maxwell's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and his expression changed completely. "Excuse me," he said, standing. "It's urgent. I need to take this." He stepped away from the table, speaking in a low voice. Riley could tell from his body language that something serious was going on. 5 minutes later, Maxwell returned with a tense expression. "Everyone, I'm sorry, but I have to go. Emergency at the Chicago plant." He grabbed his jacket from the chair. "Riley, can you?" "Of course," she said, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. "Great. Thanks, everyone, for the evening. David, we'll talk Monday about the contract." And with that, Maxwell left in a hurry, leaving Riley at the table with 4 important clients and a bill that would probably cost more than her first car. The silence that followed was broken by Michael. "Well, that was abrupt." "Classic," Riley muttered, more to herself than to the table. Patricia laughed. "Trouble with the boss? Let's just say our working relationship is complicated." The waiter appeared quietly at the table. "The check, ma'am?" Riley sighed inwardly. Of course Maxwell had left the bill for her, probably part of some elaborate test or payback for the conversation about employee benefits. "One moment," she said, reaching into her bag. Luckily, she had borrowed Maxwell's corporate card from his desk the week before, claiming she needed it for an office supply purchase. Just in case, of course. "Here you go," she said, handing the card to the waiter with a smile. David Chen looked impressed. "Crawford Enterprises is lucky to have the two of you." Riley smiled, already picturing Maxwell's reaction when he saw the corporate card statement. "Yes," she said, "I'd say we're an unforgettable team." The next morning, Maxwell arrived at the office at 7:30, earlier than usual. The Chicago emergency had been resolved overnight, a problem with the cooling system that thankfully hadn't caused major damage. But what really bothered him wasn't the plant. It was the $1,200 charge that had shown up on the corporate card statement. $1,200. For one dinner. Riley Parker had managed to spend $1,200 in a single night and still come out looking like the hero. He pushed open his office door, already rehearsing a very direct conversation about professional boundaries and misuse of company credit cards, when he froze. His desk was covered in yellow Post-its. Dozens of them, stuck meticulously to every available surface. Maxwell walked up slowly, as if the little notes might explode. "Call Mom," read the first one. "Practice non-scary smile," said another, stuck right in the center of the monitor. "Buy flowers for someone, anyone will do. Say thank you at least once today. Remember that employees are people, not robots. Consider that not everyone wakes up in a bad mood by default." Maxwell walked around the table, reading each of the notes with a mix of disbelief and something he refused to admit was amusement. Try regular coffee without demanding it be perfect. Give someone a compliment with no hidden agenda. Try not to scare the interns. Admit Riley is right at least once. That last one was stuck to the computer screen, right where he couldn't ignore it. The muffled sound of laughter came from the hallway. Maxwell looked through the glass wall and saw a small group of employees gathered around Riley's desk, whispering and laughing like high school students. He took a deep breath, gathered all the sticky notes, and marched toward her desk. Riley was calmly typing, wearing an expression of studied innocence that fooled no one. When she saw Maxwell approaching with the sticky notes in hand, she smiled. "Good morning, boss. How was the emergency in Chicago?" "Parker," he said, placing the notes on her desk. "We need to talk." "Of course. About what?" "About professional boundaries, about respect, and about the misuse of corporate credit cards." Riley tilted her head, pretending to be confused. "Corporate card? Oh, you mean last night's dinner? It was a success. David Chen was very impressed with our business synergy. I think we're going to close that deal." $1,200, Parker. An investment in the company's reputation, she replied without hesitation. Patricia Williams already called this morning, interested in consulting, and Robert Chen wants to set up a meeting to discuss partnerships. I'd say it was money well spent. Maxwell opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Sandra from IT, who came up to the desk with a look of barely disguised panic. "Riley, can I talk to you for a minute? It's urgent." Riley looked from Sandra to Maxwell. "Can it wait 2 minutes? I'm having a very productive conversation about financial efficiency." "Actually, no," Sandra whispered, but loud enough for Maxwell to hear. "It's about that photo." "What photo?" Riley and Maxwell asked at the same time. Sandra glanced around nervously before pulling out her phone. "Someone posted a photo of you two at dinner last night in the company WhatsApp group. And, well, people are speculating." She held out the phone. It was a shot taken from a distance through the restaurant window, showing Maxwell and Riley toasting, both smiling. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to recognize them. The caption read, "Squidward found love." Below it, a string of comments. "James, call the press." "Tom, I knew there was something." "No one survives 2 weeks teasing Crawford without divine protection or romance involved." "Maria, they look cute together. I bet she tamed him with pastries." "That explains why he hasn't fired her yet." Maxwell felt the blood rush to his face, not from embarrassment, but from pure, genuine irritation. "Who posted this?" "We don't know," Sandra said quickly. "The account is anonymous, but there are already 43 comments." Riley took the phone from Sandra and began reading through the comments, an amused expression spreading across her face. "Someone needs to make a documentary about this. Oh, this one. From enemies to lovers, a corporate saga." "Parker," Maxwell said, his voice dangerously low. "Oh, this is good. He finally found someone who's not afraid of him. Must be love." Riley laughed. "They're pretty romantic, don't you think?" "Parker." She looked up from the phone, still smiling. "Problem, boss?" The look Maxwell gave her was unlike any before. It wasn't the usual irritation, sarcasm, or even anger. It was something more intense, more personal, as if she'd crossed a line he didn't even know existed. "My office." "Now," he said, turning away. Riley handed the phone back to Sandra. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," she whispered. "Riley," Sandra said, holding her by the arm, "he seems really angry." "He always seems angry. It's his natural state." But as she walked toward Maxwell's office, Riley noticed employees discreetly positioning themselves for a better view of the glass-walled room. Some pretended to work, but it was obvious they were all waiting for the next episode of the corporate soap opera. Maxwell stood behind his desk, facing the window, his back to the door. When Riley entered, he didn't turn around right away. "Close the door," he said. Riley obeyed, noticing that his tone had changed. It wasn't the irritated boss tone she was used to. It was more controlled, but also more dangerous. "Sit down." She settled into the chair, crossed her legs, and waited. Maxwell finally turned around, and she saw he was holding a folded newspaper. The local business paper. "Have you seen this today?" he asked, setting it down on the table. Riley looked at the front page and felt her stomach twist. There it was, the same photo from WhatsApp, only now in high resolution and on the front page of the business section. The headline read, "Maxwell Crawford on romantic dinner. City's most eligible CEO finds love." "Ah," was all she could manage. "Ah." Maxwell repeated, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "That's all you have to say?" Riley grabbed the paper and skimmed the article. It was pure speculation based only on the photo, but it mentioned her mysterious presence in Maxwell's life and quoted sources close to him, suggesting a developing corporate romance. "Well," she said at last, "at least they didn't mention the coffee incident." Maxwell stared at her for a long moment. The silence in the room was so heavy she could hear her own heartbeat. Then he leaned over the table, resting his hands on the surface, and looked straight into her eyes. Riley braced herself for yelling. Accusations, threats, maybe even a dramatic firing. What she didn't expect was for Maxwell to step away from the table, walk to the window, and stand there in silence for almost a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was strangely calm. "I need your help." Riley blinked, certain she had heard wrong. "I'm sorry, what?" Maxwell turned, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Vulnerability. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. "I got a call from the federal audit office last night. That's why I left the dinner so suddenly." He took a deep breath. "They're investigating the company for suspected tax fraud." Riley straightened in her chair. "Tax fraud?" Someone leaked information suggesting we have shell accounts that were evading taxes. Maxwell came back to the table, but this time he sat in the chair beside her instead of behind the imposing mahogany desk. It's a lie, obviously, but an accusation like that could destroy the company, even if it's false. Riley finished for him. Exactly. The investigation started yesterday. I have 72 hours to hand over all the requested documents and prove our innocence. Riley studied him carefully. There was something else, something he wasn't saying. And where do I come in? Maxwell hesitated, clearly wrestling with his pride. You notice things I don't. Patterns, inconsistencies, details that slip by others. He looked straight at her. I need someone who can review our books with fresh eyes, someone not emotionally tied to the numbers. You want me to audit your own company? I want you to help me find who's behind this, because someone on the inside leaked that information, and that person has access to data very few people have. Riley leaned back in her chair, processing it. Maxwell Crawford, the man who had spent 3 weeks trying to make her quit, was asking for her help to save his company. Why me? She asked. You have a whole team of accountants, internal auditors? Because you're the only person here I know for sure isn't involved. Maxwell ran a hand through his hair. And because you're annoyingly good at finding problems I'd rather ignore. Annoyingly good? Riley repeated with a small smile. Don't let it go to your head. She stayed quiet for a moment, watching him. There was something almost desperate in the way he held himself, even though he was trying to hide it. All right, she said at last. I'll help. Maxwell let out a breath of relief he clearly hadn't meant for her to notice. Thank you, Parker. Riley stood, but before leaving, she turned to him with a mischievous smile. Oh, but there's one condition. What is it? You have to say please. Maxwell looked at her as if she had just asked him to dance naked in the lobby. I'm sorry, what? You asked for my help, but you didn't say please. My mother always said magic words open every door. Parker, it's a simple word, 6 letters, it won't hurt. Maxwell closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, there was a look of complete surrender on his face. Please, he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't hear you. Please, Riley, will you help me? She smiled, satisfied. Of course, when do we start? Now. The next 4 hours were the strangest of Riley's professional life. She and Maxwell worked side by side in the conference room, surrounded by stacks of documents, spreadsheets, and financial reports. He had ordered that no one disturb them, and the door stayed shut as they combed through years of accounting records. Take a look at this, Riley said, pointing to a spreadsheet. These monthly payments to Hartman and Associates. $20,000 a month, every month, for the past 2 years. Maxwell leaned in to get a better look, and Riley noticed he smelled good. Not the expensive cologne she expected, but something more subtle, more personal. Hartman and Associates, he murmured. Never heard of them. The listed service is General Strategic Consulting. Pretty vague. Too vague. Riley kept flipping through the documents. And there's more. These payments started exactly 1 week after you closed the deal with Chen Industries. Maxwell stopped writing. David Chen? The same one from the dinner last night. Riley looked at him. Coincidence? I don't believe in coincidences. They worked in silence for another hour, and Riley began to notice little things about Maxwell she hadn't before. He had a habit of lightly chewing on the end of his pen when he was deep in thought. He doodled in the margins of papers. Nothing fancy, just lines and geometric shapes. And when he found something interesting, his eyebrows would draw together in a way that was almost cute. Parker, he said suddenly. Why did you agree to help me? Riley stopped typing and looked at him. Honestly, because even though you're a terrible boss, a corporate tyrant, and have the empathy of a rock, I don't think you're a criminal. Maxwell let out a dry laugh. Thanks, I think. And because, she went on, if someone's trying to hurt the company, they're hurting everyone who works here. Maria, Brian, Sandra, Tom, they don't deserve to lose their jobs because of someone else's schemes. Maxwell watched her for a long moment. You really care about them, don't you? Of course I do. They're people, not numbers on a spreadsheet. And me? The question came out before he could stop it. Riley stared at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. What do you mean? Nothing. Forget it. Maxwell turned back to the documents, his face closed off again. But Riley kept looking at him, seeing for the first time not the intimidating CEO, but the man behind the mask. And for the first time, she wondered what kind of person Maxwell Crawford would be if he wasn't always trying to prove something. Maxwell, she said, using his first name for the first time. He looked up, surprised. You're a person too, and people deserve second chances. For a moment, the silence between them was different. Not tense, not laced with jabs, almost comfortable. Then Maxwell's phone rang, breaking the moment. Crawford, he answered. Riley watched his expression shift from neutral to concerned to something close to fear. I understand. Yes, we'll be there. He hung up and looked at Riley. That was my lawyer. The auditors want a meeting tomorrow morning. And they've already found irregularities. Riley didn't know what to say. It was nearly midnight when Riley found the folder hidden in the back of Maxwell's personal file drawer. They had decided to search his office for any clues about who might have access to the company's confidential data. I found something, she said, pulling out a yellowed folder labeled Personal MC. Maxwell, who was across the room going through old emails, turned around. That's probably not relevant to the investigation. Maybe not, but Riley opened the folder and froze. Inside were old newspaper clippings, photos, and documents that clearly had nothing to do with business. The first photo showed a boy of about 10, alone at an elaborate birthday party. There was a huge table with a cake and expensive decorations, but no other children in sight. Maxwell, she began, hesitant. Put it down, he said, his voice tighter than usual. But Riley was already looking through the rest. Newspaper clippings about young heir to the Crawford fortune, more photos from social events where Maxwell was always alone or standing beside stern adults in suits. One photo in particular caught her eye. Maxwell at 15, receiving an academic award. He stood on stage holding a plaque, but there was no one in the audience clapping, just empty chairs. Oh my God, she murmured. Parker, I told you to leave it. Riley looked at him and saw something that surprised her. Shame. Maxwell was ashamed of those photos, of a childhood where every image screamed loneliness. Your parents? Where were they? Working. Always working. Maxwell stepped closer and closed the folder. My father believed children didn't need attention, only structure. My mother agreed. And friends? It's hard to make friends when you're homeschooled with private tutors and only go out to events where you're the only kid there. Riley felt her heart tighten. Suddenly his arrogance, the way he struggled to connect with the staff, it all started to make sense. Maxwell, No, he cut her off. I don't want your pity. I had everything money could buy. Except for the things money can't buy. They stayed quiet for a moment, the weight of the truth hanging in the air between them. Riley took a deep breath. She needed to break the tension before Maxwell shut down completely. Well, she said with a purposely lighter tone, at least now I understand why you're so terrible at small talk. Maxwell looked at her, surprised by the change in tone. Excuse me? You never got any practice. Kids learn to socialize by playing, making friends, and fighting on the playground. You skipped all that and went straight to business meetings with serious adults. Despite himself, Maxwell gave her a small smile. Are you psychoanalyzing my childhood now? I'm explaining why you're socially traumatized. Riley sat on the edge of the table. But don't worry, there's a cure. There is? Of course, you just need practice. And as it happens, I have an idea that can kill two birds with one stone. Maxwell frowned. What idea? Riley picked up one of the documents they had found about the mysterious Hartman and Associates. I found out they're hosting a charity event on Saturday. An art auction. The kind of thing where rich people go to show off and make connections. And we're going. Parker, we can't just show up at an event. As a couple, she went on, ignoring his interruption. Maxwell was silent for a few seconds. As a couple, he repeated slowly. Exactly. You need to learn how to behave socially, and I need to get into that event to find out who's behind Hartman Associates. It's perfect. Riley, this is ridiculous. Why? You can't pretend to like me for a few hours? Maxwell stared at her, and Riley noticed there was something odd in his expression. It wasn't irritation or sarcasm. It was uncertainty. That's not it, he finally said. Then what's the problem? Maxwell hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I'm not good at this kind of thing. Social events, small talk, pretending to be normal. Riley felt a pang of tenderness for the vulnerable man showing through behind the intimidating CEO image. Relax, she said with an encouraging smile. It's just acting. And look on the bright side. I'm great at pretending not to like you. I've had 3 weeks of practice. Maxwell let out a genuine laugh, and Riley realized it was the first time she'd actually heard him laugh for real. Is that supposed to reassure me? Absolutely. If I can pretend not to find you annoying, you can pretend to tolerate me. And if someone recognizes us after that photo in the paper, even better, everyone will think we're on a perfectly normal date. No one will suspect we're investigating. Maxwell went quiet, clearly thinking it over. Are you sure this will work? Maxwell, Riley said, standing and walking over to him. Do you trust me? That's a dangerous question. It's a simple one. He looked at her for a long moment. Strangely, yes, I do trust you. Then trust this too. We'll go to the event, find out who's trying to destroy your company, and save everyone's jobs. And if we fail, Riley smiled, then at least you'll have learned how to be social. Win-win. Maxwell shook his head, but he was smiling. You're completely crazy. And you're socially traumatized. We make the perfect team. All right, he said at last, but if this goes wrong, it's going to work. Riley grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I just need to know one thing. What? Can you dance? Maxwell paled. Why? Because these events always have dancing, and couples in love dance. Riley? Don't worry, she said, already walking out. If you survived a lonely childhood and became a successful CEO, you can learn a few waltz steps. She stopped at the door and turned back one last time. And Maxwell? She said softly. For what it's worth, you weren't the problem. Your parents were the ones who missed out on knowing an incredible son. With that, she left, leaving Maxwell alone with his thoughts and a strange feeling in his chest he couldn't quite identify. The next morning, Riley arrived at the office with a clear mission: to practice her loving girlfriend act for that night's event. What she didn't expect was how much fun it would be to tease Maxwell in the process. Good morning, darling, she said, placing a cup of coffee on his desk with an exaggeratedly sweet smile. Maxwell nearly choked on the water he was drinking. Parker, what are you doing? Practicing. If we're going to pretend to be a couple tonight, I need to get used to the role. She leaned over the desk, pretending to straighten some papers, and whispered, Sweetheart, you need to relax more. You're way too tense. Maxwell glanced around nervously. Several employees had stopped working to watch the scene. Riley, shh, she put a finger to her lips. Let me take care of you today. You work too much. Tom from marketing walked past their desk and whispered to Jessica. She really tamed Crawford. Riley heard and smiled even more. Maxwell, darling, how about we have lunch together today? I know a romantic place. My office. Now, Maxwell said through clenched teeth. Of course, love. Riley winked at Sandra, who was staring with her mouth open. As soon as the door closed, Maxwell turned to her. What do you think you're doing? Rehearsing. You said you're not good at this kind of thing, so I'm helping you get comfortable. Calling me love in front of everyone? It works, doesn't it? Riley sat down and crossed her legs. Look at how the staff is reacting. They think you're humanized. Maxwell paused, considering. Humanized? Yes. Before, you were the scary boss. Now you're the scary boss with a girlfriend who calls you darling. It's less intimidating. Before Maxwell could respond, his former secretary, Jennifer, knocked on the door. Mr. Crawford? The auditors are online too. Maxwell picked up the call, and Riley watched his expression grow darker and darker. I see. Yes, we'll be there at 3. He hung up and looked at Riley. They found more irregularities. I think of the bank transfers we can't explain. How much? $200,000 in 6 months. Riley stood, all traces of playfulness gone. Where did it go? That's the problem. The destination accounts are ghosts. They exist on paper, but we can't track who really controls them. Riley began pacing, thinking. Maxwell, who else has access to the financial system besides you? The CFO, Robert Chen. Maxwell stopped. Wait, Robert Chen? David Chen's son? The one at the dinner? No, Robert Chen is our CFO. He's worked here for 5 years. Riley frowned. But at the dinner, there was also a Robert Chen, the investor's son. 2 Robert Chens. Maxwell picked up the phone. Jennifer, bring me the personnel file for Robert Chen, our CFO. 5 minutes later, Jennifer brought the folder. Maxwell opened it and showed Riley a photo. "This is our Robert Chen." Riley looked at the photo, then at Maxwell. "Maxwell, that's the same man who was at the dinner last night, the one who introduced himself as David Chen's son." The silence in the room was deafening. "He was at the dinner," Maxwell said slowly. "He heard our conversation about efficiency, about cutting benefits. And he was there when you rushed out for the emergency," Riley finished. "He knew you wouldn't be coming back." "So he's not David Chen's son. He's our employee, pretending to be someone else, so why?" Riley took the folder and started flipping through the documents. To gain the trust of real clients? To get information? She stopped on one page. "Maxwell, look at this." It was an old reference letter. The address for Robert Chen's previous job was the same as Hartman and Associates. "He planted the fake consulting firm," Maxwell whispered, "and used our own business meeting to sneak in with real clients." Riley met his eyes. "We've got our culprit." In that moment, they were no longer boss and employee, or two people rehearsing for an event. They were partners, and the electricity between them had nothing to do with acting. When Maxwell saw the full name in Robert Chen's personnel file, his face went pale. "Robert Chen Williams," he read aloud. "My God, Riley, I've known this man for 20 years. "What do you mean?" "Robert Williams. He changed his last name." Maxwell sank into his chair. "We were childhood friends, the only friend I ever had." Riley's stomach dropped. She had seen the pictures of Maxwell's lonely childhood the night before. "Maxwell. He showed up here 5 years ago, introduced himself as Robert Chen, said he'd moved from California. I didn't even recognize him. He looked different, thinner, dark hair." Maxwell rubbed his face with both hands. "How could I have been so blind?" "He betrayed you," Riley said softly. "He used your friendship, your trust. The only real friendship I ever had." Riley saw the pain in his eyes and felt a surge of anger toward the man who had hurt Maxwell like that. "We're going to expose that rat," she said firmly. "I have an idea." An hour later, they had set up the perfect trap. Riley would create a fake, supposedly confidential investment contract with numbers tempting enough to lure Robert into leaking the information to his partners. They would leave the document strategically accessible and wait. "The FBI will be monitoring his communications," Maxwell explained. "If he takes the bait." His phone rang, cutting him off. Maxwell looked at the screen and frowned. "New York General Hospital," he answered quickly. "Hello." Riley watched his expression shift from confusion to panic. "What? When?" Maxwell stood up. Yes, I'll be there. I'll be there in an hour." He hung up, his hands shaking. "My father. Heart attack. He's in the ICU." Riley stood immediately. "Go. Now." "But the plan? The trap, if we're not here to monitor?" "Maxwell." Riley stepped closer and without thinking took his hands in hers. "Go, I'll handle the rest." Her touch was gentle, warm, and Maxwell felt something stir in his chest, something that had nothing to do with his father's situation or the company. It was something he'd been trying to ignore for weeks, but now, with Riley's hands in his, it was impossible to deny. "Riley, I can't leave you to deal with this alone." "Yes, you can." She squeezed his hands. "Trust me." Maxwell looked into her eyes and saw determination, strength, and something else that made his heart race. "If something goes wrong." "It won't. Go be with your father." He hesitated for a moment, then pressed a quick kiss to her forehead, a spontaneous gesture that surprised them both. "Thank you," he whispered before running out. Riley stood there for a moment, her hand touching the spot where his lips had been, then focused back on the mission. The next 6 hours were the longest of her life. She monitored Robert, planted the document, coordinated with the FBI, and waited. By 7 in the evening, Robert had taken the bait exactly as expected. When the agents arrested him, Riley was hidden in the conference room, watching through the glass. Robert shouted about misunderstandings and conspiracies, but the evidence was undeniable. Maxwell returned to the office at 10 that night, exhausted but relieved. His father was stable. "How did it go?" he asked, finding Riley still in the conference room, surrounded by documents. "Mission accomplished," she said simply. Maxwell looked out the window and saw the last police cars leaving. "You pulled it off. Alone. The plan was yours. I just carried it out." "Riley," Maxwell stepped closer. "You saved my company. You saved everyone's jobs. You saved me." She smiled, tired but content. It was my job. No, he said with a seriousness that made her meet his gaze. It was much more than that. 3 days after Robert Chen's arrest, Crawford Enterprises was back to normal, or at least what passed for normal in a company where the secretary had become a local hero and the CEO had developed the unusual habit of smiling at employees. Riley was organizing the last of the investigation files when Jennifer announced over the intercom, "Mr. Crawford, Andrew Collins is here for your 2 o'clock meeting." Riley looked up, curious. She didn't remember any Andrew Collins on Maxwell's schedule. A few minutes later, a young man, probably in his 30s, walked into the office with Maxwell. He was tall, well-dressed, with an easy, confident smile that seemed natural, not like the forced executive grins Riley was used to. "Riley," Maxwell said, his tone slightly tense, "this is Andrew Collins from Collins Investment Group." "Andrew, this is Riley Parker, our—" He paused for a fraction of a second. "Director of Strategic Development." Andrew walked over to her desk with his hand extended. "Miss Parker, it's a pleasure to meet you. I read about your work in resolving the Robert Chen situation. Very impressive." Riley shook his hand, noticing his grip was firm but not overpowering, and that he looked her directly in the eyes, signs of someone used to treating people as equals. "It was a team effort," she replied modestly. "I'm sure it was." Andrew smiled. "In fact, I hope to have a chance to speak with you later, if you don't mind. I have a few questions about corporate management strategies." Riley noticed Maxwell stiffen slightly beside Andrew. "Of course," she said, "I'd be glad to." The meeting between Maxwell and Andrew lasted 2 hours. Riley could hear them talking in the conference room, though she couldn't make out the words. The tone seemed cordial and professional, but there was something about Maxwell's posture when they walked out that suggested tension. "Riley," Andrew said, approaching her desk again. "That conversation I mentioned, would you have a few minutes now?" "Of course." Andrew glanced around the busy office. "Maybe somewhere more private? How about the coffee shop on the corner?" Riley hesitated. There was something in the way Maxwell was watching them from the doorway of the conference room that made her feel like she was about to do something wrong. "All right," she said finally. The coffee shop was small and cozy, the kind of place where freelancers worked on laptops and college students came to study. Andrew ordered 2 coffees and settled into the corner table he'd chosen. "Riley," he began, getting right to the point, "I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't come here just to meet Maxwell." "You didn't?" "I came because of you." Andrew leaned forward slightly. "I have contacts in the business world, and your name has been coming up. What you did at Crawford Enterprises, not just the investigation, but the way you transformed the company culture, is exactly the kind of leadership I'm looking for." Riley blinked in surprise. "Leadership? I want to offer you an executive director position at one of my companies. Collins Tech, specifically." Andrew pulled a card from his pocket. "Starting salary of $300,000, performance bonuses, full creative freedom to implement your own management strategies." Riley stayed silent, processing the offer. $300,000 was nearly 10 times what she earned now. "Andrew, that's very generous, but you don't have to answer right now," he said quickly. "Think about it. You have real talent, Riley. You shouldn't waste it being someone's secretary." When they returned to the office an hour later, Riley immediately noticed Maxwell standing near his office window, watching the entrance. When he saw them together, his expression turned strange. Not exactly angry, but there was something territorial in his look, mixed with something that almost seemed like fear. "How was the conversation?" Maxwell asked when Andrew said goodbye and left. "Interesting," Riley replied, deliberately vague. Maxwell waited for her to elaborate, but she just went back to work. The next day, Andrew showed up again. Officially, it was to finalize some contract details with Maxwell, but Riley noticed he spent more time at her desk than in the conference room. "Have you thought about my offer?" he asked quietly. "I'm still considering it." "Riley," Jessica whispered after Andrew left, "what's going on? The atmosphere here is weird." "What do you mean?" "Crawford's acting like a territorial cat. Yesterday, he walked past your desk 6 times in an hour. And this morning, he asked Jennifer if she knew what kind of business Andrew was in." Riley glanced toward Maxwell's office and saw him watching through the glass, wearing an expression she was starting to recognize as barely disguised jealousy. On Thursday, Andrew showed up for the third time. Maxwell, clearly running out of patience, decided to fight back. "Riley," he said loud enough for the whole office to hear, "I need you to join me for the meeting with the Japanese investors next week. In Tokyo." "Tokyo?" Riley repeated, surprised. "It's a very important contract. I need someone I trust to handle the strategic aspects." Andrew, who was chatting with Jennifer at the front desk, clearly heard every word. "Of course," Riley replied, trying not to smile at Maxwell's obvious move. An hour later, Maxwell appeared at her desk with a bouquet of flowers. "For you," he said, placing them on her desk with exaggerated formality. "Maxwell, why?" "To thank you for your excellent work." He spoke loud enough for Andrew, who was stepping off the elevator, to hear. "You are invaluable to this company." Riley looked at the flowers, then at Maxwell, then at Andrew, who was watching with an amused smile. "Thank you," she said, trying not to laugh. By the end of the afternoon, Maxwell had casually mentioned in front of Andrew that he was considering promoting Riley to vice president, that she was indispensable to the company's operations, and that he was planning to double her salary. When Andrew finally left, Riley turned to Maxwell. "Seriously? What? Tokyo? Vice president? Doubling my salary?" Maxwell had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "I may have exaggerated a bit." "A bit? Riley?" He walked up to her desk. "What did he offer you?" She studied him for a moment. "Why do you want to know?" "Because." Maxwell hesitated, clearly struggling for words. "Because I can't lose you." The raw honesty in his voice caught her off guard. "Maxwell, whatever he offered, I can top it. This isn't about money." "Then what is it about?" Riley looked at him, seeing vulnerability where there had only been arrogance before. "It's about where I belong." On Friday, Riley spent the entire day looking at Andrew Collins's business card in her drawer. The offer was tempting, not just the money, but the chance to start fresh, to prove herself in a company that would see her as a director from day one, not as the secretary who spilled coffee on the CEO. But every time she thought about saying yes, her mind went back to Maxwell. To the vulnerability she had seen in his eyes when he learned about Robert. To the way he had trusted her to save the company. To the way he now smiled at the employees. Small, genuine smiles she knew were because of her influence. At 3 o'clock, she made her decision. "Jennifer," she said, grabbing her bag, "I'm heading out early today. If anyone asks, tell them I had a doctor's appointment." "All right, dear. Are you feeling okay?" "I am. I just need to take care of something important." Riley took a cab to the Collins Investment Group building downtown. It was impressive. Glass and steel, modern, with a stunning view of the bay, the kind of place she could be happy working. But it wouldn't be home. Andrew greeted her in his 40th floor office with that warm smile she was starting to like. "Riley, what a pleasant surprise. I hope you have good news for me." "Actually," she said, sitting in the chair across from his desk, "I do have news, but it might not be the news you want to hear." Andrew's smile faded slightly. "You're turning me down?" "I am." Riley took a deep breath. "Andrew, your offer is amazing, more generous than I ever expected. Anyone in their right mind would accept it. But my place is with Maxwell, at Crawford Enterprises, with all the people I've grown to care about there." Andrew leaned back in his chair, studying her. "It's him, isn't it? Maxwell Crawford?" Riley felt her cheeks grow warm. "It's complicated." "Oh, Riley." Andrew smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I hope he realizes how lucky he is. Honestly, I don't think he does, and maybe he never will." "Then maybe it's time you told him." Riley was about to respond when the office door burst open. Maxwell stormed in like a hurricane in a suit with misdirected determination. "Andrew Collins," he said, not even glancing at Riley, "we need to talk." "Maxwell?" Riley stood shocked. "What are you doing here?" "Stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life," he replied, finally looking at her. Andrew rose slowly, clearly amused by the scene. "Mr. Crawford, what a pleasure to see you here, though I must say your entrance was dramatic." "You can't have her," Maxwell said, pointing an accusing finger at Andrew. "She's mine, she works for me, Maxwell," Riley cut in, "you're making a scene." "I'm making a statement," he said, turning to her. "You can't leave, Riley. I won't let you." "You won't let me?" Riley repeated, her voice dangerously low. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Maxwell?" She crossed her arms. That I'm your property? That I don't have the right to choose my own future? I meant that you. Maxwell ran his hands through his hair, clearly lost. That I can't imagine the company without you. That I can't imagine my life without you. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Maxwell's heavy breathing. Andrew cleared his throat softly. Well, I suppose that's my cue to leave. Riley, the offer still stands if you change your mind. He walked toward the door but paused, turning to Maxwell. And Crawford? Next time, maybe try flowers instead of barging in. Works better. When Andrew left, Riley and Maxwell were alone in the sleek office, looking at each other. I came here to turn him down, Riley said finally. Maxwell blinked. You did? I did. I spent the whole day thinking about it, and I realized my place is at Crawford Enterprises, with Maria, Brian, Sandra, and everyone else. With you. With me? Yes, you idiot. With you. Riley shook her head. But then you show up here like a bull in a china shop, assuming I was going to take the job, making a completely unnecessary scene. Riley, no. She grabbed her purse. I'm going home. When you decide to act like a civilized adult instead of a possessive CEO, give me a call. And with that, she walked out of the office, leaving Maxwell alone with his shame and the growing realization that he had just messed everything up. 2 hours later, Maxwell was standing at Riley's apartment door. He ditched the suit and was wearing only jeans and a casual shirt, clothes Riley had never seen him in before. It made him look younger, more human. When Riley opened the door, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her. I want you back, he finally said, but not as my secretary. Riley crossed her arms, still upset. As what, then? As my partner. In the company and in life. Maxwell, only if you promise never to wear that Disney villain black suit again, she said, trying not to smile. And no more dramatic scenes in other people's offices. Maxwell let out a low laugh. I promise, no villain suits, no dramatic scenes. And you have to learn how to talk about feelings without sounding like you're negotiating a contract. That might take some time. I'm patient. Maxwell stepped closer, holding out his hand. So, partners? Riley looked at his hand, then at his face. Partners, she corrected, placing her hand in his. Maxwell gently pulled her closer and, for the first time since they met, kissed her. It wasn't dramatic or desperate. It was soft, tentative, full of unspoken promises. When they pulled apart, Riley smiled. That was much better than any dramatic scene. Good, Maxwell said, smiling back, because I plan on doing that a lot more often. 6 months later, Crawford Enterprises was unrecognizable. Not physically. The building was the same, the desks were the same, even the fake plants were still in the same spots. But there was something completely different in the air. The sound of genuine laughter echoing down the halls. Riley, now officially director of special projects, was in her new office, still on the same floor as Maxwell, but now with her own desk, a window overlooking the city, and a nameplate on the door she had insisted on choosing herself. It read simply, Riley Parker, Director of Projects and Spilled Coffee Specialist. Maxwell had resisted the coffee part, but Riley had been firm. It's part of our story, she had argued. Besides, it reminds me every day how we got here. That Tuesday morning, Riley was reviewing proposals for her newest project, the Crawford Enterprises Employee Wellness Program. It was an ambitious initiative that included fully restoring the benefits that had been cut, plus new programs like flexible hours, on-site childcare for employees with young kids, and a mentorship program pairing senior staff with new hires. How's it going in here? Maxwell appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Much better now that you've brought a bribe, Riley said with a smile, taking one of the cups. I learned from the best. Maxwell had changed a lot in recent months. The intimidating black suit had been replaced with more casual attire, gray, navy, sometimes even without a tie. More importantly, his permanently serious expression had been replaced with something much closer to genuine happiness. The cleaning lady just stopped me in the hallway, he said, sitting down across from Riley's desk. She wanted to thank me personally for bringing back the health plan. She said she can finally get that cataract surgery she's been putting off. And Brian? He got the promotion yesterday. He's so nervous he can barely speak, but Jessica says he hasn't stopped smiling since he found out. Riley smiled, feeling that warm sense of satisfaction she always got when she saw the positive impact of their changes. "You know," Maxwell said, taking a sip of coffee, "sometimes I still can't believe this all started with you spilling coffee on me. Technically, I didn't spill coffee on you. I flew with coffee toward you. It was fate." "Fate, huh?" "Fate. The universe knew you needed someone to mess up your perfectly ordered life." Maxwell laughed, a sound Riley never got tired of hearing. "My life wasn't perfectly ordered. It was empty." The honesty in his voice still surprised her sometimes. The Maxwell she'd met 6 months ago would never have admitted something so vulnerable. And now? Now it's chaotic, unpredictable, full of employees who are way too happy, and meetings where people actually say what they think. He paused, looking straight at her. "It's perfect." Before Riley could answer, Sandra from IT appeared in the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but Riley, the folks on the 3rd floor want to know if they can go ahead with that idea for the break room with a video game." "Approved," Riley answered without hesitation. "But no violent games. We want relaxation, not adrenaline." "Perfect." Sandra practically danced out of the room. "Video games at the office?" Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "Studies show that recreational breaks can boost productivity by up to 30%, Riley replied in her best teacher voice. "Besides, it was Brian's idea, and after everything that poor guy went through with defective staplers, he deserves an Xbox. You're going to turn this place into a high school. I'm going to turn this place into a place where people want to work. There's a difference." Maxwell stood and walked to the window. "Are you sure you don't want that job with Andrew Collins? It's still a better offer financially." Riley watched him for a moment. It was a question he asked at least once a week, always with the same slightly uncertain tone. "Maxwell Crawford," she said, getting up and walking over to him. "How many times do I have to explain that I don't want to be anywhere else?" "A few more times, just to be sure." "All right, I don't want Andrew's job because here I have Maria bringing me homemade pastries every Friday, because Brian comes to me with stapler problems, because Sandra sends me memes during boring meetings." She stepped closer. "And because here I have you. Even though I'm a terrible ex-boss and a mediocre current boyfriend, especially because of that, someone has to keep civilizing you." That night, Maxwell took Riley to dinner at the same restaurant where everything had gotten complicated 6 months earlier. But this time, there were no clients to impress, no emergencies to interrupt, and no unpaid bills left behind. "Remember the first time we came here?" Riley asked, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "I remember you charging $1,200 to my corporate card and still managing to come out looking like the hero. One of my best performances. And I thought you were trying to sabotage me." "I was, but then you ran off and left me with a massive bill and 4 strangers, who, by the way, ended up becoming regular clients." "True. David Chen closed 3 more contracts with us this month." They ate in a comfortable silence for a few minutes until Maxwell cleared his throat nervously. "Riley? I have a question for you." Something in his tone made Riley stop eating and give him her full attention. Maxwell shifted in his seat, clearly nervous, then stood and knelt beside the table. "Maxwell, what are you?" He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "Riley Parker," he said, his voice slightly trembling, "you've turned my life upside down since the first day we met. You've taught me that real leadership is about caring for people, not controlling them. You've shown me that a company can be both successful and humane, and you." He opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant ring. "You've shown me that I can be loved not in spite of my flaws, but because of them." Riley covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes filling with tears. "You'll have to love me even if I spill coffee on you again," she said, her voice breaking. Maxwell laughed, that genuine laugh she loved. "I'll love you especially if you spill coffee on me." "So, yes," he said before she could even finish the question. "Yes to everything, forever." And when he slid the ring onto her finger, Riley realized that sometimes the best stories begin with the most awkward accidents, especially when they involve spilled coffee and impossible bosses who, in the end, turn out to be extraordinary men. What did you think of Riley and Maxwell's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to follow all our stories. And take a moment to watch more touching stories by clicking here on the final screen.